Hello, and welcome to episode 10 of Sarastero's Star Wars painting series. In this episode, we're going to begin painting the hero miniatures from Fantasy Flight's Star Wars Imperial Assault, beginning with Jyn Odan. Before we start, I'm going to preface this next set of videos with some additional preparatory ideas, which will cover an alternative, stronger method of rebasing, as well as showing how to use green stuff to fill in unwanted gaps. After preparing the miniatures, we're going to paint Jyn Odan using a standard approach of applying base colours, shading with washes, adding highlights, and finishing touches. If you've been following this series so far, you should have a pretty good grasp of all the basic techniques required. Let's begin. Before priming the hero figures, you may notice one or two gaps, such as we see here. This is pretty common in multi-part miniatures, and it's fairly simple to fix using some green stuff. If you haven't used it before, green stuff is a commonly used two-part modelling putty that should be widely available. It usually comes in strips like this, where we can clearly see the two parts of the compound, the yellow part being the filler and the blue part the hardener. A little water applied to your fingers and modelling tools will prevent the green stuff from sticking to them and make it much easier to work with. All we do is cut the amount off we want and knead or twist the putty until the blue and yellow parts are fully mixed to create a smooth green. From this moment on, the green stuff will begin slowly drying, but does take some time, so there's no need to rush. All we do now that the green stuff is thoroughly mixed is apply a small amount to the gap we want to fill and press it in, removing any excess as we work. Once we're happy that the gap is filled, we can either add texture as appropriate or smooth it over, and there's nothing wrong with using our fingers to do this. Drying times may vary, but it will remain malleable for up to about an hour. Once done, it's best to leave the miniature overnight to fully cure before spraying with the primer. I've chosen to spray most of my heroes, including the Wave 1 heroes and villains, white, except some of the darker miniatures such as the Wookiees and IG-88, which I've chosen to spray black. If white is all you have though, that would be fine. I'm now going to rebase my hero miniatures in a similar way to that which I used to rebase Darth Vader in episode 7, except I'll be reinforcing the miniatures with some wire. To do this, you will need some cutters, a modelling drill, some wire, and a simple paperclip is ideal for this, and some superglue. You'll want a drill size that is just marginally wider than the wire you're using. After removing the miniature from its original base and selecting a new one, we carefully drill directly up into the soles of the feet, taking care not to drill too far, which could cause us to puncture the leg. If that does happen, however, it shouldn't be too difficult to repair with a little green stuff. We then clip off around 1 centimetre or so of wire and superglue it into the holes. We now mark out where the counterpart holes need to go in our chosen base. We then drill down into the base, and it doesn't really matter if we come out the other side or not. You can then either clip the wires and glue the hero in straight away, or, as I'm doing, glue the hero to the base after painting. If you do choose to stick the figure down after painting, as I am, you can temporarily mount it onto a wine cork to make it easier to handle. With the preparatory work done, we're now ready to begin painting. For the base colours, I'm starting with a 50-50 mix of black and Mechanicus standard grey for all of the black areas. That means the boots, leather straps, belt, hair and gun. As usual, we thin all our paints with a little water and apply more than one layer as necessary to achieve strong, even coverage. Once the black areas are done, we can use Kislev flesh for the skin. For the orange parts of the jacket and gloves, I'm using Fire Dragon Bright. However, a virtually identical colour can be achieved with an equal mix of Flash Gitz Yellow and Wild Rider Red, as you can see here. We can now appreciate the value of using a white primer, as with a black primer we would have to work a lot harder to achieve such a striking bright orange tone. We can then use some Steel Legion Drab for the trousers and brown parts of the jacket and gloves. Finally, some Runefang silver for the silver details, such as the tip of the gun and the belt buckles. It's worth having a final check and doing any necessary neatening up before moving on to the shading stage. With the base colours applied, we're ready to do some shading. We can now apply some dark washes to the miniature, and I'm going to start with some straight Nuln oil for all of the brown, black and white areas. Before washing the gun, however, I would first give it a silver dry brush. For the skin, I've chosen a slightly delicate 50-50 mix of Reikland Fleshade and Lahmian medium. This can be built up in a couple of layers to gently strengthen the shadowed areas, such as under the chin, nose and the eyes. Finally, for the orange parts of the jacket and gloves, I'm going to use a 50-50 mix of Fuegan Orange and Agrax Earthshade. I've chosen to add the Agrax Earthshade to produce a stronger tone to deepen the shadows. Once the shades are dry, we're ready to begin the highlights. We're now going to highlight the jacket, starting with a reapplication of Fire Dragon Bright. Jin's jacket is the most visually striking part of the miniature. It is therefore the part we're going to give the most attention. Here we want to avoid the areas we want to remain shadowed, and bring the rest smoothly back up to a strong, bright orange. After the Fire Dragon Bright, we then mix in some yellow for the next highlight. I'm using Yriel yellow, but Flash Gitz yellow would also be fine. As usual, a gradual build-up of thin layers is the way to achieve smooth transitions. For the next highlight, we can use pure yellow. Naturally, the lighter we go, the smaller the area we want to hit. When deciding how bright to take our highlights, it's worth considering what type of material we're trying to render. For this jacket, we're going for a shiny leather look, which means we can be quite extreme with our highlighting. I'm therefore going to add an even lighter final highlight by adding a little white to the yellow. This wants to be applied sparingly to just some of the edges and most raised parts of the material. We can now begin to see the jacket really coming to life. Once we're done, we could finish the orange off with a yellow glaze, which we can apply undiluted to the whole area and which should help tie the layers together. With the hardest part done, we can now highlight the rest of the miniature, starting with some white scar for all of the white areas. It's quite okay for the white armour to have a slightly uneven, weathered finish. Using nicely thinned paint means you can revisit an area and subtly brighten it further with additional layers. For the trousers, I'm using some Steel Legion Drab. We don't want to go over the top with the highlights here, as we're aiming for quite a dark matte finish. And don't forget, when the miniature is viewed, it's the vivid orange jacket that will draw most of the viewer's attention. I'm then adding just a little white for a second gentle highlight. I'm applying this to just one or two places, including perhaps a couple of the raised folds on the jacket, as well as the tips of the gloved fingers. For the black areas, I'm using some Eshin grey to begin with. I'll be adding a little white to produce a slightly lighter second highlight, especially for the hair. The The skin can have a highlight of Kislev flesh. And, once again, we can simply add some white for a second highlight, paying particular attention to the nose and cheekbones. Finally, you might like to pick the belt buckle out with a small hit of Runefang steel. Once done, we're ready for some finishing touches. We're now going to paint the eyes using a fairly simple but effective approach, bearing in mind our goal of achieving a good tabletop standard. With our smallest brush, we're going to paint the whites of the eyes, which may seem tricky given how small they are and the fact they're not especially well defined. Our plan is to use a black wash after this to shade the surrounding area and give definition to the edge of the eye. So the white we're applying now doesn't necessarily have to be perfect, and it can afford to cover a slightly larger area than we might expect. Now we tilt the figure back and apply some neat Nuln oil to each eye, encouraging the wash to collect around the edges as best we can. Notice how the black wash does a nice job of effectively shrinking the white areas back down, and where it collects at the sides can even give the impression of pupils, as if Jin is giving a sideways glance. This should give a result that will look fine on the tabletop, although you could of course do some additional retouching if you wish. At this point, I've also chosen to boost the highlights on the hair and some of the black areas of the clothing, with quite a light white and Eshin grey mix. I'm then going to give the hair a gentle purple glaze, with a roughly 1 to 3 mix of Druchii violet and Lahmian medium. More than one layer of this can be applied, depending on how strong you want the resulting colour to be. A glance at the character art tells us that Jin's outfit has an additional detail that we can add at this stage: the light stripes down the side of her trousers. For that, I'm using Rakarth flesh, but any light beige colour would do. We can then use a little Nuln oil to shade the creases. Once we've finished adding the final details, we need to paint the stand, and here I've used the same steps used in episode 7, which means a combination of grey and silver dry brushing and some Nuln oil to add some shadow. We then spray both with our matte varnish. Once dry, we clip the wires back and glue the figure into the base. One final touch that I couldn't resist is to add a thinned gloss varnish, using an equal mix of water and varnish, to the orange leather of the jacket to give it a gentle leathery sheen. And this completes Jin Odan. Thank you as always for watching, and especially for all of the Patreon support this channel has received so far. Stay tuned as we'll soon be moving on to the next hero from Star Wars Imperial Assault. Happy painting!